The 1970s, a decade that birthed disco, punk, and hip-hop all at once. But what if I told you this musical explosion was driven by technology as much as creativity?
Oh, that's an intriguing perspective. How exactly did technology shape the music landscape of the 70s?
Well, it all comes down to the rapid advancement of electronic instruments and recording techniques. The development of synthesizers, in particular, opened up entirely new sonic possibilities. Take Kraftwerk's 1974 album Autobahn. It's often cited as a landmark in electronic music history, paving the way for genres like synthpop and techno.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't just about new musical styles, but also new ways of creating sound altogether?
Exactly. And this technological revolution wasn't limited to electronic music. Even traditional genres were transformed. For instance, the evolution of multi-track recording allowed for more complex arrangements in rock and pop. Artists like Stevie Wonder and Elton John used these advancements to create lush, layered soundscapes that would have been impossible in previous decades.
That's really interesting. When most people think of the 70s, they probably think of disco first. How did that fit into this technological landscape?
Ah, disco, the genre that defined an era. Interestingly, disco both embraced new technology and harked back to earlier styles. The four-on-the-floor beat was often created using drum machines, while synthesizers provided those iconic sweeping strings. But at the same time, disco drew heavily from funk and soul, creating a unique fusion of old and new.
Right? And disco wasn't just about the music, was it? It was a whole cultural phenomenon.
Absolutely. Disco represented a shift in how people consumed music. The rise of nightclubs and discotheques changed the social aspect of music. It wasn't just about listening anymore. It was about experiencing music in a communal setting. This shift had a profound impact on everything from fashion to social norms.
Mm-mm. And while disco was dominating the dance floors, other genres were pushing boundaries in different ways, weren't they?
Oh, definitely. Take punk rock, for instance. While it might seem like the antithesis of disco's slick production, punk was also a product of its time. The raw, DIY ethos of punk was partly a reaction against the perceived excesses of mainstream rock and the polished sound of disco. Bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols stripped rock back to its bare essentials, creating fast, loud, and confrontational music that challenged the status quo.
It's amazing how these seemingly opposite genres could coexist and even influence each other. Were there any other significant developments in rock during this time?
Well, the 70s saw an explosion of rock subgenres. We had glam rock with its theatrical performances and androgynous aesthetics, exemplified by artists like David Bowie and T-Rex. Progressive rock pushed the boundaries of what rock could be, with bands like Yes and Genesis creating complex, often conceptual albums. And let's not forget about the birth of heavy metal, with Black Sabbath's self-titled debut in 1970 often cited as the genre's starting point.
Wow, it really was a decade of musical diversity. But it wasn't just about Western music, was it? What was happening in other parts of the world?
You're absolutely right. The 70s saw significant developments globally. In Africa, particularly Nigeria, Afrobeat was gaining traction. Fela Kuti, often called the father of Afrobeat, was blending traditional West African music styles with funk and jazz to create a politically charged, highly danceable new genre. In Latin America, we saw the peak of the Nueva Canción movement, which became the music of various social and political movements.
That's fascinating. It seems like music was really intertwined with social and political changes during this time.
Absolutely. Music has always been a reflection of society, but in the 70s, this connection seemed particularly strong. Take hip-hop, for instance. While it didn't become mainstream until the 80s, its roots were firmly planted in the 70s. DJ Kool Herc's block parties in the Bronx laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most influential musical and cultural movements of the 20th and 21st centuries.
It's incredible to think about how many genres that are now established were just starting to take shape back then. Even classical music was evolving, wasn't it?
Indeed it was. The 70s saw the rise of experimental classical and minimalist music. Composers like Philip Glass and Steve Reich were challenging traditional notions of classical composition, creating hypnotic, repetitive pieces that would go on to influence not just classical music, but popular and electronic music as well.
So, how did all these changes in music production and consumption affect the industry as a whole?
Well, that's a great question. The 70s saw a significant shift in how people engaged with music. The rise of FM radio and the album format changed listening habits. We moved from a single-driven market to a more album-oriented approach. This gave artists more freedom to create cohesive bodies of work, rather than just hit singles.
Oh, and that led to the rise of the concept album, right?
Exactly! Albums became more than just collections of songs. They became complete artistic statements. Think about works like Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, or Marvin Gaye's What's Going On? These weren't just collections of songs, but cohesive artistic statements that tackled big themes and ideas.
It's fascinating to see how all these elements, new genres, technological advancements, changes in music consumption, came together to create such a vibrant and influential decade in music history.
You're absolutely right. It really was a perfect storm of creativity and innovation. And while we often talk about the 60s as being the decade that changed everything, I think a strong argument could be made that the 70s were equally, if not more, transformative when it comes to music. The 70s took the foundation laid in the 60s and built upon it in ways that continue to shape music today.
That's an interesting perspective. So, how do you think the music of the 70s continues to influence what we hear today?
Well, the influence is everywhere if you listen closely. The resurgence of disco in modern pop, the continued evolution of hip-hop, the lasting impact of punk rock, all of these can be traced back to the 70s. Even the way we use technology in music production today has its roots in the innovations of the 70s.
That's true. It's like the 70s laid the groundwork for so much of what we hear today.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the sound. It's about the attitude, too. The experimentation, the boundary pushing, the blending of genres. These are all things we value in music today. And they all have their roots in the 70s.
So, what do you think we can learn from the music of the 70s as we look to the future?
That's a great question. I think one of the big lessons is the importance of embracing change and innovation. The artists who really made an impact in the 70s weren't afraid to try new things, to push boundaries. They used new technology to create sounds that had never been heard before. As we move forward, I think it's crucial for artists to maintain that spirit of innovation.
That makes a lot of sense. Any final thoughts as we wrap up our journey through 70s music?
Well, I think the 70s show us that music is always evolving, always changing. It's a reflection of our society, our technology, our hopes and fears. As we face new challenges and opportunities in the 21st century, I'm excited to see how music will continue to evolve and reflect our changing world. Who knows? Maybe we're on the cusp of another musical revolution right now.
That's an exciting thought to end on. Thanks for taking us on this musical journey through the 70s.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time, keep those records spinning and your ears open to the echoes of the past in the music of today. This is Oki Radio, signing off.